Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on the surge of online counterfeits and how brands can avoid it. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be made available to Vogue Business members on the Vogue Business website following today's panel. We will also be hosting a short Q&A at the end of the discussion, so please send in your questions and we will answer as many as possible. Great, so my name is Hillary Milnes. I am the Americas editor at Vogue Business. Joining me today is Julie Zerbo, a lawyer and founder and editor-in-chief of The Fashion Law, a leading source dedicated to the field of fashion law and the business of fashion. Also here today is Mike Sweeney, director of service delivery and senior legal counsel at branding protection firm IncoPro. Mike counsels brands on all aspects of brand protection, including trademark strategy in the online space and the use of data-driven technology to combat threats. Welcome both, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Hillary.
Pleasure, Hillary. Good to be with you.
Of course. So earlier this year, we covered beauty's surge in counterfeit cases, which explored the correlation between the rise in online purchases amid the pandemic and counterfeit sales. Of course, as we know, this is something that affects more than beauty, so we want to get an understanding of the counterfeits market, what's driving its growth, and then dive into how brands both large and small can protect themselves from counterfeiters. So just to get an idea of where we stand with the global counterfeit market, just to note this is something that is always changing, but roughly 3.3% of global trade is suspected to be counterfeit, according to data from OECD. As of 2018, and again, this is something that's changed over the course of the pandemic specifically, but roughly 1/3 of the counterfeit luxury market was online as of 2018, and that has only grown since then. To give an idea of the breakout of counterfeits by category, as you can see, footwear and clothing top fake goods online and in-person sales, and many fashion and beauty related categories are leading other industries in terms of fake goods. And thank you to IncoPro team for sharing this data with us. So let's turn it to you, Mike. Tell us a bit about what IncoPro does and how it works with brands.
Thanks very much, Hillary. Great to be with you today. So I'm an attorney with IncoPro. I'm based in our London office, and we use data-driven technology and data analysis to identify and remove instances of brand and content misuse, including intellectual property infringement from locations across the internet. And we work with several hundred of the world's most famous and best known brands from a broad range of sectors, including, of course, luxury and fashion.
Great. And so whenever you're working with brands, especially this year, what are top of mind for their concerns?
Well, I mean, of course, this year has been a year like no other. I think entirely unique compared with anything that any of us have ever seen before. The pandemic has really driven a seismic increase in e-commerce and has, I think, accelerated the shift away from traditional brick and mortar type retail towards online. And, in some ways, we are seeing that for some of our customers, that can be regarded as a positive development, particularly and, most obviously through the creation of new channels for brands to use to connect with their consumers. But it has also, of course, brought into really sharp focus that brands, perhaps more than ever before, need to be doing much more to protect their rights and also their consumers online. There are so many data points around this and so many reports circling around, the precise impact of the last few months. But I think to put the pandemic in context, the consulting firm Bain & Company recently published some data showing that online luxury purchases were worth, I think, $58 billion in 2020, and that's compared with $38 billion in 2019. So, a very, very significant increase, of course, brought around by COVID.
Great. And Julie, tell us in a nutshell, when you are working with brands and speaking with brands, can you explain the legal problems that they face when dealing with counterfeits?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the primary legal problem is counterfeiting. You know, that's the legal problem that they're facing here. The the manufacturing and sale of products that bear trademarks that are, you know, substantially indistinguishable from their own marks, their own registered marks, I should say, more specifically, and you know how they deal with that
Mhm.
in, you know, as much of a proactive way as they can, given that it's my view that brands can't really avoid counterfeiting, whether they want to or not. I think the fact that, you know, footwear and clothing are top of the list here, indicates that Nike, for instance, is heavily impacted by counterfeits. And if they can't stop it, I'm not sure, you know, who can. The same goes for LVMH and all of these truly enormous and well-funded companies.
Right. And so when we are thinking of, you know, the traditional counterfeit market sales happening offline, and now as sales are moving more online, how does this, you know, what does this change for brands from, you know, just the size of the problem and how they can respond to it?
I mean,
Mike, you want to start, or Julie, go ahead.
I can start and then pass off to
Mm,
Mike. I mean, I think
sure.
that the problem has been consistent in that if you talk to lawyers, they, for, you know, decades have described dealing with counterfeiters as a game of whack-a-mole. You get rid of one, another one pops up just as quickly. And I think that that's only been accelerated with the rise of the internet and you know, the increased sophistication of counterfeiters, their operations, what they're doing to try to get around protections put in place by certain platforms, whether we are seeing them, you know, use hidden links, which was at issue in a recent lawsuit filed by Amazon, or whether they're directing buyers off of these platforms to other sites like WhatsApp so that they can complete these transactions.
Mhm.
We're seeing different developments, you know, across the board, really.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I think, you know, counterfeiters and their behavior doesn't exist in just one channel or on one platform, you know, and in one territory. What we're seeing more and more nowadays is, you know, sophisticated networks of organized, you know, commercial enterprise scale infringers who operate, you know, across platforms, so between social media marketplaces and through connected websites and so on, and you know, do that in a way that makes detection ever more difficult for brands. And also, it's constantly changing. You know, they're constantly evolving their behavior and, you know, doing their utmost to you know, to get away with it, basically. So I think, you know, what's very clear is that brands are having to take a different approach nowadays. I think, you know, the days of lifting the phone to your attorney and asking them to, you know, engage with the platform and have a listing removed are long gone. You know, because of the sophisticated nature of the networks that I've just talked about. So, you know, really without having a data-driven tech solution, it makes it very difficult for brands to have a you know, comprehensive and you know, full picture of the infringement landscape that they're trying to tackle. So the technology is absolutely key on this.
Right. So as the counterfeiters are getting more savvy, the brands have to up their responses as well. And I just wanted to touch on, you know, especially this year as we've seen more sales moving online. We're always constantly talking about this acceleration that we've seen towards digital for brands in the pandemic. This is kind of like the seedy underbelly side of that. As you have more business moving online, you're going to have more counterfeits moving online, and it's, you know, it's not something that, you know, it's foremost top of mind for brands. But
Mm.
Mike, have you seen cases rise and just the volume of counterfeits rise this year, and also during high volume shopping periods like we just had the holiday season? And I think you have some data as well.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The significance of these, retail events as they've come to be known, can't be overlooked. And I think if brands are not, proactive in trying to get ahead of those events, then they can really, pay the penalty. So again, it's about using the tech in a way, configuring, configuring the system and making sure that any new collections or launches are taken into account, and just trying to do your best to thwart infringers who would absolutely take advantage of these holidays and retail events.
Mhm. And so, in talking about what brands can do to protect themselves, you mentioned a more data-driven response. Can you elaborate a bit on that, and especially in terms of how, what brands can do? Is that something that they do in house? Are they working with partners? How does that work on the strategy level?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think more and more these days, and again, to repeat the point, this was true before the pandemic, and is especially true in light of it. If you are serious about tackling this problem as a brand, particularly in light of some of the staggering statistics that fly around in relation to the scale of this problem, then more and more it's just so very clear that without having reliable data, without having data that is put together and brought in centrally from across platforms and across different regions, then you're always going to be being reactive to the problem. And we're starting to see brands embrace that, and really, as I said a minute ago, to put this absolutely at the front and center of their business, rather than being something that was sort of non-core and thought about later on in terms of strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Julie, did you want to add to that?
I mean, I think that Mike really has it covered on that front. I think that, yes, this is kind of like a living, breathing organism, the field of counterfeiting, and it is constantly evolving. And that's something that brands absolutely need to be cognizant of in shaping their strategy, both from an in-house perspective and when working with outside partners, because at the end of the day, it does start in-house. And evolves from there.
Mhm. And if you're a smaller brand with fewer resources than, as you mentioned, the Nike and LVMH, are you like, how do you stand up against this massive problem?
I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, I don't really have a good answer for how
Hmm.
small companies can kind of address this. Most
Hmm.
small companies don't have a ton of in-house help, and in those instances it makes usually the most sense for them to work with outside partners that can get a handle on this and use the budgetary spend that they have for counterfeiting and other IP
Hmm.
enforcement in the most effective way, I think.
Mhm.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, I think it's the same principles that apply, just as they would for Richemont, LVMH, Nike, Gucci, whoever. But it's a question of prioritizing your resources. So at the risk of laboring the point, that the tech is still absolutely key, just as is so important to invest in a really strategic IP portfolio, making sure that that's watertight so that you can remain competitive. I think design rights are very important here. Often overlooked, but really very, very important for luxury and fashion businesses. And I think actually that's especially important as 3D printing continues to evolve as a threat. It's very important to have a strategic and consolidated IP portfolio to be able to overcome that. But if you are a smaller player in the market, then as well as prioritizing your resources, the other thing that's terribly important is collaboration. So looking to collaborate with other other brands and others in the industry, because of course, counterfeiters don't operate conveniently, focusing just on one brand, on one platform. You're very likely to encounter multiple brands all lumped in together as part of that counterfeit operation. So that's where collaboration is really important, pooling resources, and actually, if possible, sharing data as well, so that the problem can be attacked from that perspective as well. Very important.
Yeah, and you mentioned platforms, so it'd be great to kind of walk through the places where customers and brands are most at risk. According to IncoPro, we have the top 5 platforms where counterfeiting is kind of the biggest problem. Especially, and it's interesting, you have Instagram and Facebook here alongside the more likely places like Amazon. So, it seems like just as counterfeiters are ramping up their tactics, they're also appearing in different places, as shopping is also happening in different places as well.
Yeah, so I think that's right, and looking at this sort of league table, if you like, arguably no surprises in terms of the the most problematic platforms. I think it's important to stress that this is based on enforcement data, and it's specific to the IncoPro customer base. And Shopee, Amazon, and eBay, they're very well known as being problematic platforms, and actually in particular, the inclusion of Shopee at the very top there is, I think, reflective of major problems in the region in general. Platforms operating in that region tend to have inadequate practices around brand protection, poor response times, poor practices in relation to repeat infringers, and all of that kind of thing. So, the Shopee inclusion of Shopee is deliberate there because it's a very problematic platform. And just to touch on Instagram and Facebook as well, of course, social media platforms, again included there in the the top of the league table, in order to just reflective of the fact that infringers are starting to move away, or have long since moved away from online marketplaces where they face a higher chance of detection, and can perhaps operate within social media with a greater chance of remaining undetected. So
yeah, and we've seen it's and platforms like Facebook, it's been a very ongoing legal question when it comes to things like content and sharing news and who is responsible for what. Julie, from a legal standpoint, how is Facebook and Instagram dealing with counterfeits different than an Amazon or an eBay or Shopee dealing with counterfeits?
Well, I mean, first things first, I think that this list is interesting, and I think that the inclusion of Instagram and Facebook is definitely interesting. It mirrors the submission that the American Apparel and Footwear Association made to the U.S. Trade Representative just last month, seeking to add the Instagram and Facebook platforms to the USTR's 2020 Bad Actors Notorious Markets list, which they pointed out as significant, in that the counterfeiters really are flocking to that. That's not new, but we're seeing a lot more there, and that's significant. In that letter, the American Apparel and Footwear Association pointed to kind of a lack of proper procedures on behalf of Instagram and Facebook. One of the things that they touch on is Facebook's kind of unwillingness to remove very obvious hashtags like designer fake or something like that on the grounds of free speech, which I found to be quite interesting in kind of the larger picture of what we're dealing with when it comes to Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mike, did you want to add anything there? It's because it's such a different. Oh, sorry, Julie.
Oh, sorry. He can go. I can.
Sure, Mike, did you want to jump in?
No, I think Julie had it covered. Yeah.
I was just going to add, I think it's interesting too, in terms of kind of where, from a US legal perspective, how we're seeing kind of a shift in, where liability can potentially lie. And there's quite a bit of evolution in that space happening all the time in courts across the US.
Right, which is my next question. Like, who should be held responsible for taking action against counterfeits? I think we have, even looking at this list, it's a vast spectrum of responses on behalf of the companies. You have, a Facebook situation where they're getting tied up in free speech and their own policies. Amazon, we know, has a lot of work that it's put into this. But who is liable, and is that shifting over time?
I think that there's two answers here. There's the, straightforward legal answer, which is it's the duty of the trademark holder, of the rights holder, to police unauthorized uses of their mark. We're also seeing, a shift since the 2004 Tiffany versus eBay case, in which the Second Circuit held that Tiffany was not liable for the counterfeit goods on its site because it was the seller, and it didn't meet the knowledge standard. We've seen updates in courts, various courts, centering on Amazon and their liability for goods that come technically from third-party sellers, but are kind of fulfilled by Amazon, and how that potentially changes the analysis of whether or not Amazon is adding something to the distribution chain. So that's interesting. Jeff Bezos, of course, said this summer that, maybe the government should implement stronger counterfeiting laws. But I also think that when we're looking at, big platforms, whether it be Alibaba or Amazon, part of the, and Instagram too, frankly, part of the question here is what's the aim? If Amazon's trying to launch and bolster a luxury platform, they need to gain consumer trust about the authenticity of goods on their site. The same goes for Alibaba when they, launched quite successfully, I think, their luxury pavilion and things like that. So, I mean, it's not, for me, just a question of who, technically has the liability or who has the responsibility. It's what are you trying to achieve here? Because no one's going to shop on your platform if it's riddled with fakes.
That's a great point. Mike, what's your perspective there? I think it's an interesting push and pull. And then when you're working with brands, how do you communicate that, where the responsibility lies?
Yeah, I mean, so I completely agree with Julie. I mean, look, individual brands will always be responsible for policing and enforcing their rights. That's the starting point, the very clear starting point. And in fact, we've actually got some data that we can wrap around this. We recently did a consumer survey where we were, I think we canvassed 2,000 consumers in the US, and 69% of those that took part believed that brands are responsible for protecting them from fake versions of their products being sold online. So 69% say it's up to the brand to protect them from fake versions of their products being sold online. So I thought that was quite a compelling finding coming out of that survey. But look, platforms have to be accountable as well. And I think now, perhaps more than ever before, we're seeing legislative and regulatory pressure being applied by, national governments to internet platforms. There is a clear and discernible shift towards enhanced platform accountability. We're seeing that, very clearly in Europe with initiatives such as the Digital Services Act. So a package of measures aimed broadly at, making platforms more accountable. and enhancing consumer and brand protection. And that, of course, mirrors similar legislation in the US with the Shop Safe Bill and related legislation there. So it's a mixture. Brands, platforms, governments. It's a mixture. But I think when all said and done, it's likely that this is going to fall to the brands to police and enforce, to the fullest extent.
Right, because of course the brands have a ton at stake here in terms of customer trust and reputation. So taking this all into consideration and looking ahead, it seems we had this, like, it's a chain reaction. You have, a huge swell of online sales. This was preceding the pandemic, of course. To begin with, you have this rise of platforms like Instagram and Facebook getting more involved in shopping. And then, the response needs to be maturing as well. So like you mentioned, the legislation, the restrictions that are coming up. What do you see being the long-term effects of these change in customer patterns in, where people are shopping? What will be the next response to counterfeiting from here? I know we've talked about blockchain and new technologies that are coming up to more, get a global response to products and tracking there. What do you both kind of expect to see coming down the pipe in response to this? Julie, if you'd like to start.
Sure. I'll leave kind of the tech point to Mike because I know that that's very much in his wheelhouse. For me, I'm curious to see how increasing attempts to pass legislation play out here in the US, and if they do actually get enacted, some of these bills, how effective they will be. Mike mentioned the Shop Safe Act here in the US, which was proposed this year, and it aims to hold platforms accountable for the sales of counterfeit goods on their sites. But there's some interesting kind of caveats, in my opinion, in that it will only, the act will only apply if the products pose a risk to consumer health or safety. I'm not sure how easy it will be to argue that a fake Louis Vuitton bag poses a risk to consumer health or safety. I'm sure that there's creative lawyering to be done there. And there's also an interesting kind of carve out if platforms can show that they're, following best practices, which, a company like Amazon might be able to show in light of increased litigation when it comes to counterfeit. So I'm curious to see how the law kind of evolves with this kind of explosion in counterfeits online.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike, did you want to add to that and talk a bit about how you expect the technology to evolve?
Yeah, I mean, look, so at the risk of stating the obvious, the shift to digital is the new norm, and brands need to be digitally savvy, using data-driven tech, to the fullest extent, and to have the most impact. But the challenge with digital is that there's a huge amount of opportunity for infringers, counterfeiters to access a global audience very easily. But on the other side of that, consumers expect to be able to purchase a purchase a product in just a couple of clicks nowadays. So, building trust in that environment and stopping consumers from encountering counterfeit products in the first place is very difficult. So there's there is a balance to be struck there. I think especially in light of all the trends that we've seen this year. But I think with if brands can show a willingness to deploy innovative techniques and to embrace technology and get to grips with this, then that will go a long way to repairing some of the problems we've seen this year, for sure.
And I kind of slipped it in there, but what are your thoughts on the blockchain and how it might play a role here?
I think it's untested so far. There's a lot of opinion and not much evidence. I would say at this point to draw any draw any meaningful conclusions just yet on its impact, but certainly something to watch going forward.
Great. Julie, did you want to add anything else?
I think that that's pretty much it.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we are going to head to audience questions, but before we do that, I wanted to highlight a few of the key takeaways from the conversation that we just had. So again, to state the obvious, as business is moving online, counterfeits move along with it. It's a natural shift, as well as one that has been accelerated by the pandemic. So that includes, more counterfeit sales online, more places for counterfeiters to meet and sell to customers. And then I think, as we've said, the response and the reliability or responsibility and liability will have to change as well. So brand protection needs to become a core strategy. It can't really be an add-on. And there are various ways to do this, obviously, depending on the size of your brand, but that includes outside help, technology playing a key role, as well as data. The response needs to be digital to a problem that is increasingly digital. And then liability is shifting from brands to platforms. And then as you have new platforms, so we've kind of moved from like the traditional Amazons, Alibabas to the Facebooks, the Instagrams. And so I think we can expect to see more platforms being held more responsible here, but ultimately, to Mike's point, it does come down, this is a brand issue at its very core.
I wouldn't say it's shifting necessarily away from brands, just as like a last minute takeaway here. Brands, I think, remain responsible. It's just platforms are also increasingly kind of being pulled in terms of liability. So brands are not like off the hook here by any means.
Great. Yes. Thank you for pointing that out. It's definitely a brand problem. Great. So we have a few audience questions here. So one question, that I think I'd like to add a little bit to is, do brands need to avoid marketplaces like Amazon? I think it's a bigger question than if they need to avoid it. But, is there something that could happen where if the response to counterfeits isn't great enough, that brand trust and customer trust could break down with platforms? Mike, did you want to start there?
Yeah, I mean, look, you touched on it earlier, and again, at the risk of stating the obvious, if a platform is riddled with counterfeits, and if not enough is being done to clean up that platform, then brands are going to want to distance themselves as far as possible, from that platform. Their consumers are being exposed to risk, which for obvious reasons is unacceptable. But I do think there's a balance to be struck there. There are opportunities to embrace with platforms, particularly as practices and policies become ever tighter around, to adopt Amazon's well-rehearsed phrase, to drive counterfeits to zero. And I think that's particularly true for maybe for the smaller fashion brands that we touched on earlier, who have less resources, and they might find that appealing. And of course, over in Asia, as initiatives such as Tmall's Luxury Pavilion on Alibaba start to gain much better traction and become really well established. So I don't think it's a question of avoiding marketplaces, but I do think it's one of choosing who you work with very carefully.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. And I wonder if you actually can avoid some of these marketplaces, given that they're third-party marketplaces. Nike, for instance, pulled all of its authorized products off of Amazon. Nike products are still on Amazon by way of third-party sellers. So I think that it's not a matter of whether or not you can avoid these platforms. You clearly can't. It's like Mike said, it's about working with these platforms. And I also think that there's potentially a consumer education element that is relevant here, educating your consumers about who your authorized retailers are and things like that.
Yeah, which is a great point because we have two questions that touched on education. So, do you think brands are doing enough to kind of address the situation head on, educate customers, publish guidelines on how to avoid counterfeits? Because it's interesting, especially when you get into the luxury realm, it's almost, they don't really want to address it, it seems.
Um, I can speak to that quickly. I mean, I think that some brands address it. I think that brands are hesitant to put out point by point guides about authenticating their products because counterfeiters will be the first to jump on that and
Mhm.
use that to make better fakes. Some sites do that. The Real Real, for instance, puts out guides periodically, like how you know if your Kelly bag is real or whatnot. I think that certain brands are trying to get consumers to help. I know UGG, for instance, has for a while had a rather robust consumer education element to their brand.
Yeah. Mike, how does education come up in your role in your conversations with brands? Is that, I know it's not the like tech and data driven response, but it seems like it could be like kind of square one.
I think Julie's absolutely right. You don't want to equip the very people who would seek to undermine the value in your brand with any ammunition allowing them to do that. And also, I think perhaps subconsciously, formal statements and publications like that can also serve to sort of validate the fact that there's a problem in the first place. So it's not something we see terribly much, but brands have to use the tools available to them, social media and so on, and retain the trust of their audience, and make sure that there's enough of a level of engagement among the consumer base, that no one's going to run into any problems.
Yeah. And then last question, how does the lack of consistent global legislation make this a harder job for brands, marketplaces, customers? Would a unified response be beneficial to this? Julie, you want to take that?
Certainly, but
Yeah.
we're kind of asking a question that I mean, yeah, it would be great if we had one uniform law. I think that the jurisdictional nature of things like trademark law probably is the reason why companies like IncoPro and things like that and their digital based technologies are so popular because it just becomes really unaffordable for brands to hire teams in every different jurisdiction, in China, in the US, in these places where they, frankly have very different laws.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, just to add to that, the territorial nature of trademarks presents difficulties there in terms of having a consistent and unified global approach. It's not really something that's realistic at this point. And also, I think in circumstances where the regional disparity is so great between how platforms in China or Southeast Asia approach this issue as compared with platforms in North America and Europe, there's always going to be to a certain extent, there's always going to have to be a local element to going about enforcement.
Mhm. And just to wrap up, because we've had a few mentions of it in the chat as well, is blockchain a substitute for this very impossible unified global response? Could it be that way of making something traceable across countries, not tied to any one jurisdiction? Mike, I know you said it's not quite proven yet, but I'm interested to hear if it were to get there, is that something that is interesting to you?
Yeah, I mean, of course, and there are obvious advantages around supply chain, issues, and being able to track component parts of constituent parts of counterfeit products. It's definitely something that it's a positive step forward, and something that brands should look to embrace, ever more. But I just remain slightly, just want to see what the tangible, data-backed benefit of it is before we'll have a fuller and more complete understanding of its, possible potential.
Yeah, great. And Julie, what are your thoughts on the potential blockchain in this case?
I mean, I have healthy skepticism as well, I guess. I think we're a ways off. I think that if anything, companies like Entropy and ones that are doing work in that space are the ones that we're seeing right now. I'm also curious, of course. I think that uh, the fight against counterfeiting is always an uphill battle, and anything that could serve to assist brands is a good thing and something to look forward to.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We are going to make this available on the site, as I mentioned, for Vogue Business members. Thank you to all of our viewers and our panelists for joining us today. For all information about a Vogue Business membership, please visit voguebusiness.com/membership. Thank you all and have a great weekend.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.